Advanced Resin is here. Stay tuned for this customizable earring project. So today I'm going to show you guys how to make a really fun pair of earrings using UV resin and paper. And we're going to use some beads, some sunstone beads up at the top, but you can use any beads you want and any paper you want, which is what I really love about this project. You can make it your own. You can use any type of paper if you have concert tickets or stubs or love letters, notes from your loved one, anything like that, or just a cool pattern, cool colors. You can use that in this project, and that's what makes this so fun, and you can really make it your own. Now let's go over the tools and supplies that you're going to need for this project. First, we're going to need UV resin. Second, we're going to need our earring mold. We are going to need a torch or a lighter. Any kind of heat source will do. We are going to need our UV light to cure our resin, a rotary tool, sandpaper, assorted round files, so a big one and a little one, a pick tool, a pencil, chain nose pliers, round nose pliers, flush cutters, scissors, and whatever paper you want. We're going to need 24 gauge gold wire, and we're going to need a pair of gold ear wires, and then our little 4 to 5 millimeter sunstone beads. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing you're going to do is, for this project, I modified my mold a little bit. You don't have to do this. It made making this project a little bit easier for me. So what I did, in your mold, there's a little stick that makes a hole in your earring. So I just cut that out with my flush cutters because I wanted to go in and drill my own hole. So that's just a little modification that I made. It made it a little bit easier for me, but you don't have to do that. So the first thing we're going to do is start with our resin. This is your clear, hard UV resin, and it's super easy to use. There's no mixing, really nothing to it. You pour straight from the bottle. It's got a nice fine point to it, and I'm just going to add my resin straight to my mold. And one thing I want to say is that when you're doing resin earrings like this, especially a more complex project, I would make both earrings at the same time. I'm just going to make one because I've already made a set, but I would do each step for both earrings at the same time. That way when you get to the end, you have a really, both of your earrings look the same, because a lot of times I forget what I did or I do something different on the other earring and then they end up looking totally different. So that would be one of my tips, is to do both earrings at the same time. On this mold, we've got 3 different earring styles. They're all really cute, really fun. I'm going to be using the circle mold, but you've got these 2, the teardrop molds, and then kind of the C-shaped mold. And then you've got little components up here that you can make to kind of connect your earrings to your ear wires. I'm not going to use those. I'm just going to use these circle parts right here. So I'm going to open up my resin. When you first get this, you're going to need to cut the tip open. I try to cut as close to the top as I can and at a little bit of an angle so that my resin doesn't come out too fast and I can really control my pour. So I'm going to turn this over and I'm just going to squeeze this directly into my mold, and I'm not going to fill it all the way up right now. One of the things about working with UV resin is that it does best when you work in layers, and it cures best when you work in layers. So I'm going to do, has 2 purposes, this first layer. One, for curing purposes, I need to keep it thin as I cure, but I'm also, when I pop this out, going to use it as a stencil to cut out my paper shape. So I just want to take my pick tool and move my resin, make sure I've got the entire thing covered in resin. I've got a good nice layer here. I might need to add a little bit more just so that I don't have any gaps. And always put your top back on your UV resin. This cures with light, so if any light gets in the little hole that you cut, you're going to start curing whatever resin the light touches. So the tip is going to get really gunked up because it's going to start to cure in there. Okay, so now I've got a really nice layer of resin in here, and I'm just going to go in with my pick tool and try to release some of these bubbles from the edges. That's one of the things that people struggle with the most when they're making resin jewelry is the amount of air bubbles, especially with epoxy resin. You don't get as much with UV resin, but you will get some. And when you're using a mold, the bubbles tend to cling to the edges of your mold, and any corners, anything like that, that's where your bubbles are going to go. So you want to use your pick tool to just run it along the surface and try to release any of those bubbles from the bottom or from the edges before you start to cure it, because once you start curing, you cannot get rid of the air bubbles again. So another thing, just make sure you have some paper towels or tissues on hand to clean your pick tool. You don't want to let any resin cure on this tool. You want it to be as clean as possible when you're making jewelry. That way you're not getting old dried resin into your piece. So I'm going to clean my tool off, and then the next thing is the really fun part. We're going to use a torch or a lighter to pop our air bubbles. So a few safety things before we do that. I'm going to put on my safety goggles, and I've got a little heat surface here that I'm going to transfer my mold on top. That way I don't burn anything, I don't leave any burn marks on my table, and nothing catches on fire. And another, I wanted to mention safety-wise, if you are nervous at all about safety, if you're in a really well-ventilated room, there's really nothing you need to worry about. But if you have precaution, or if you are nervous about it at all, then go ahead and you can wear a respirator, you can wear a mask, and you can wear gloves. I'm in a great room that has great ventilation, so I'm going to skip that for now, but don't hesitate to do that if you want to. So I'm going to use this lighter to pop my bubbles. You can use any kind of heat source. I think I've seen some people use blow dryers, but I like to really make sure I'm getting rid of my air bubbles. So I'm going to use the big guy. So I'm just going to turn my torch on, and I'm going to step back a little bit. I don't want to get too close to my mold, and I'm just going to kiss the resin with my torch. And I don't know if you guys could see the air bubbles popping as I did that, but it looks like, and I've got a couple more that I'm gonna, and sometimes you can pop them with your pick tool, and like those popped. I think I've got all of my bubbles popped. One reason why that's so important is that, especially on the edges, when we pull this out of the mold, if you had bubbles on your edge, then your edge is going to have craters in it, and you really don't want that. It's one thing to have bubbles like in the middle of your piece, but to have them on the edges, it kind of ends up looking like Swiss cheese, and it's really hard to clean up and to fix. You have to do a lot of filing, a lot of sanding, and it just adds time and headache to your piece. So I've got my bubbles popped, and I'm going to use my UV light. This little UV light is great. It lasts for a minute. So each curing round is a minute. I'm going to cure this for about 5 minutes, so 5 rounds. And then I'm going to pop this little piece out, and I'm going to use it as a stencil for my paper. So you may not have seen it, but I cured this for 1 minute each time, 5 times. So I'm going to press my button 5 times, 1 minute each. And then I'm going to remove my light, and I'm just going to pop this out of my mold, and it's nice and sturdy. This little clear piece of resin. And that I'm just going to set my mold aside because I'm going to need that again. But this is what I'm going to use to draw these circles onto my paper, so that I have like a little stencil for when I'm cutting out my shape. So I just want to find a piece. I'm going to find a section that has all the colors I want, has a little bit of everything in it, and then just using a pencil. And I use a pencil and not a pen because I can erase it. If after I cut it out I can see any pencil lines, I can go back in and erase it, and you're not going to see that in your final piece. So I'm just going to go around the outside edge with my pencil, and then around this inside edge with my pencil again. And then I'm just going to use my scissors to cut this piece out. And you want to cut inside of your lines because there's no way for your pencil to get really up close next to your stencil. So whatever you draw is going to be a little bit bigger than we need it to be. So cut inside your pencil lines and we should be able to fit it right back in the mold. So I'm just going to finish cutting this out and then I'll show you guys how to pop it back in. All right, so I've got my paper, my little paper ring cut out, and I'm going to put the stencil and the piece of paper back in my mold. So I'm going to pop this in real quick, like that. And this is where it can get kind of tricky, is getting this paper. It's really hard to cut this out perfectly. So it's kind of takes some finagling to get it back in, but you want it to take up as much space as you don't want to like really have any exposed edges. So we're going to kind of really smush this down in here. Get this, and I'm going to use my little pick tool to press it down in there. And just make sure it's not sticking up over the edges of my mold at all. And if it is, popped that out. If it is, and you have like a straight edge or razor blade, you can kind of use your razor along the surface here and trim off any excess paper. We can also trim off any excess paper after this is done with our file or our sandpaper. So now I've got that in there. I've got a nice solid connection in there. And now I'm going to add another layer of resin right on top of that paper. So I'm going to open up my resin and I'm just going to pour another layer, not too much, not too thick. I just want it to have a flat surface. So I'm going to go around my circle a couple times, kind of fill up the rest of the mold and make sure that all my paper is covered in resin. And I'm going to use my pick tool just to push this around, make sure it's getting all the way to the edge and around the edges of my paper. Same with the inside, and again, we're pulling any air bubbles out that need to be released from the edge. So I've got a nice layer there, and again, I'm going to put my safety glasses on, and I'm going to move this to my little heat safe surface, and I'm going to turn my torch on and just lightly kiss my resin with my flame and make sure I popped any air bubbles. So look. And then I can slide this off of this surface. And again, I'm going to cure this for at least 5 rounds under my UV light. So I'm going to get that started. The more resin you add, the longer the cure is going to take, so the more passes you have to do. You can tell if you need to leave it under longer. If you press your finger down on your resin and it sticks to your finger, then that means you need to put it back under the light for another round or 2. It just depends on how thick your resin is. All right, so now I think I'm finished curing this layer. And again, I did this 1 minute each, at least 5 times. But like I said, do your finger test. If it sticks to your finger, that means you need to put it back in again. But it's not sticking to my finger, feels nice and solid. So I'm gonna go ahead and pop this out of my mold. And there we go. So I've got a nice flat, it's a little bit concave, but I'm gonna show you guys how we fix that and how we're going to finish this up and really elevate the look of your resin. So we are done with our mold. And the next thing what we are going to do is I'm going to check my edges. This is where I'm going to file. I'm going to use my files or my sandpaper. You don't necessarily need to use files, but sometimes especially when you get close to the top of your mold surface, your resin can spill over the edge and then you can get kind of big shards of resin sticking off the side of your piece, and it's a lot easier to clip them off like with your flush cutters or to file them off with a big rough file. And then you can kind of go back in with your sandpaper to soften it up. But I'm just going to give this a couple passes with my with my big file. When I'm doing the inside of a circle, I use my big file if I can fit it in, because it's a lot easier to get a nice smooth surface, circle surface with a big file than it is with a small file. With a small file, you'll end up with little divots all in your circle, and it'll kind of not look like a circle anymore. So I'm just going to do a couple passes, trying to do it as evenly as possible. And this is another place where if your paper is exposed at all, we're going to file that back and kind of get rid of any exposed paper. And then I'm just going to go along the edge with my file, along the outside edge. And again, with a big file, you can cover a lot more surface area. But if you've got a small piece, or just a small, like you only have like one little area that you want to file, then use your small file, and you can really just get in there tight, and you don't have to mess up the rest of your surface. So I'm just going to smooth this out and soften my edges a little bit, not too much. And I'm going to go back with my sandpaper and do some softening as well. But we're going to create this dome with our resin that's really going to soften it up. So I'm going to, one way I like to sand the outside, especially with a circle, is to just roll it on my sandpaper like this. That way I'm not really like having to control that much the pressure that I'm pushing down. I mean, I'm controlling the pressure with my hand, but I'm not controlling the pressure this way with my sandpaper, so I'm more likely to get an even sand all the way across my piece. Like this. And then you can't really do that on the inside, so I'm going to roll this up. And I'm just going to do it a couple times around the inside like that. Smooth out my inside. And if you want to you can, our kit comes with several roughnesses or grits of sandpaper. So if you want to get a really, really smooth, shiny finish, you want to start sanding with your roughest grit and then work your way to the finest grit and then polish it, and then you'll get a really smooth surface. But you don't want to go from a rough grit just straight to polishing, because you'll still see some of that, the grit marks or the sandpaper marks. And then I'm going to just sand the front down a little bit. Just make sure I've got like a nice even surface, and I'm just going to gently rub this on my sandpaper like this. And then I'm just going to wipe this off with my paper towel or my tissue. And if you can see we've kind of roughed up the surface a little bit. So it's not as like high polished as it was when we pulled it out of the mold, but that's okay. We are going to use our resin to polish it up again and to create this dome effect. I really like adding the dome to my resin pieces. I think it just elevates the look and makes it look a little bit more finished. You don't have a raw straight edge or any concave edges that look like, it kind of looks like you just popped it out of the mold and put it on an ear wire. This, when we do the doming and things like that, it really shows that you put some time into it and made a really professional looking pair of earrings or whatever it is you're making. So I'm going to get down here close to my earring, and I'm going to, straight from the bottle, I'm just going to pour some resin on the top of my piece. I'm going to be really careful because I'm not in a mold anymore, and I don't want it to go over the edge. So I'm just going to do maybe 1 or 2 passes of resin. We can always build this up. If I don't get my dome high enough, I can always, after I've cured it, go back and do another round. So it's starting to make kind of a dome shape. And then I'm going to take my pick tool and I'm going to just run it along my edges and just make sure that my resin is going all the way to the edge. but not spilling over the edge. So I can just use this to kind of guide my resin to the edge, but not spill it over the edge. We don't want to go over the edge. That's why it's better to build up slowly than to try to do a huge amount of resin all at one time. Okay, so I think I've got a nice, dome. I'm going to dome the back side too, just to finish up the back a little bit. So again, I'm going to put this under my light. I'm going to do at least 5 times for 1 minute each, and then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to dome the back of it as well. Okay, so I have domed the front and the back of my piece, and I'm just going to give it a look over and make sure I like the way it looks, and I don't have any jagged, funky edges. I was able to get rid of all the bubbles with my pick tool on my dome, but if you've got some that you can't get rid of, again, just put it on your heat surface, hit it with your torch or your lighter, and pop those before you cure it. Same with the back. So I've got a nice even dome on both sides, and I'm just going to, this is one other thing that I think really can elevate the look of your piece. We're going to, I'm going to add some resin to the outside surface here and to the inside surface here, and then we're going to just give it a cure. I'm going to add very minimal resin, but because we've sanded this, it's a little rough on the edges. So I'm just going to I'm going to add a drop of it, and then I'm going to spread it all the way around my piece, and then put it in the middle of the circle too, and then I should only need 1 pass under the light to cure this because it's very thin, very minimal amount of resin that I'm going to spread around with my pick tool. And the good thing about this resin is that it's like kind of has a self-leveling property to it, so even though it looks can look kind of wavy, it'll level itself out a little bit. Just going to add a little bit to the inside because we did some sanding in there. And then I'm just going to give that one final cure, and then we will be ready to, I'm going to slide this over. So while that's going, we're going to talk about our little beaded part up at the top. So I've got some 24 gauge wire, and then I've got these really pretty faceted sunstone beads. You can use any size bead you want. I would stay on the smaller side because we're going to make a loop out of them, and the bigger you get, the harder it is to make a loop with your beads. So we're going to make this little loop section right here, and once this is finished, I'm going to show you guys how to drill a hole in your resin, and then we are going to slide our wire into that hole, and we're going to put beads on either side, and we're going to make a loop at the top and put it on our ear wire, and we'll be done. So for this particular pair, I used 4 sunstone beads on each side of my loop. So I'm just going to separate those out while we're waiting for it to cure. There we go. Finish that. And this looks great. It's got a nice smooth surface all the way around on inside and outside edges. And I am going to use my drill bit or my rotary tool to drill a hole. I'm going to put my safety glasses on so I don't get any resin shards in my eyes. And I'm just going to pick a point where I want to drill this hole, or what I want to be the top of the earring. And I'm just going to drill right through there. I'm going to drill kind of through the middle of the top of my piece. That way I don't run the risk of drilling into the edge, because if you drill into the edge, you can't use it to make your loop at the top. So I'm going to turn my rotary tool on, and I'm just going to get down here kind of almost eye level with my piece. And I'm just going to try to drill straight down. And I don't want to drill into the table, so I'm going to hold this while I drill through like that. So we've got a nice, decent sized hole here. And the most important thing when you're making a hole is just to make sure that it is level and straight through, and that you're not drilling on the edge, because there's really no going back after you've drilled, especially since we've drilled through the paper and everything. So we want to make sure we're going straight through, we're not on the edge, and we've got our hole where we want it to be. So next, I'm just going to cut a little piece of this 24 gauge wire, like about 6 inches. You don't need a ton. I'm just going to use my flush cutters to snip a piece off. And I'm going to string this, I'm going to string my earring straight on this piece right here. And just drop that kind of down in the middle. And then I'm going to string my sunstone 4 on the front and 4 on the back here of my earring. That way we can draw it up in the middle and create a nice loop. Just a little accent. I think it just added a little interest to these earrings. They would have been really cool on their own. I just wanted to add a little bit more color. And I like being able to mix gemstones and resin and paper and resin and kind of mix all the things that we use in making jewelry together. And a lot of people, I feel like there's a tendency to, when you make something out of resin, that's it. You just use the resin piece that you made. But you can really do a lot with it if you kind of look past the resin and see what else you can add to it to add some interest to your piece. So I've got 4 strung on each side here, and I'm just going to draw these pieces of wire up here together at the top and hold it, pinch it closed with, or tight with my fingers, and then just give this a little twist right here. And I'm just going to kind of, I want this to be more of a circle and not an oval, so I'm going to kind of form that shape a little bit while I've got it before I tie or make my loop up at the top. So I'm going to use both of these wires to make my loop. You can cut one piece off and make your loop out of one wire, but sometimes I like the security of using both wires. So right above where I crisscross those wires, I'm just going to grab with my round nose pliers. Actually, I think I've got I need to pull this a little tighter. I'm going to pull it a little tight. I had a little slack in my wire, so I'm going to pull that nice and tight. That way I don't have any weird gaps where I can see my wire through it. So I've got that crisscrossed, got my slack pulled out, and now I'm going to grab right above that crisscross with my round nose pliers and just pull these together up here at the top like this. And then I'm going to push forward with my wires, push my wires forward. So I'm going to keep my pliers steady and push my wire forward. And then I'm going to grab a hold of my beads, and I'm going to rotate my plier up to the top of that bend that I just made. And then I'm just going to give that a little push down into my finger so it makes this little neck, almost like the crook of your neck in the back, like you've got a little head and then it goes down into the neck. That just kind of helps you make a circle that is centered. It's going to be centered up at the top. It's going to be centered at the top with the top of your wires after we make the loop. So normally I wouldn't pull my pliers out at this stage, but I wanted to show you guys that. So holding my piece in place, I'm going to rotate my pliers towards me so that my wire is pointing back at me. And then I'm just going to grab my wires and rotate down around the bottom. And then at this point, I'm going to grab, I just think it's a lot easier to hold this in place with my chain nose. So I'm going to hold that loop with my chain nose, and I'm just going to wrap a couple times just until I get down to where my wire meets my beads. So give that a couple wraps, and I can kind of straighten those up a little bit. And then I'm going to snip those off. Is getting as close as I can with my flush cutters without cutting my other wires. And then just tuck those in so they're not sticking out and they look nice and finished. And then I'm just going to straighten my loop up, kind of straighten this loop up, make sure it's not wonky or straight on one side and curved on the other side. Just give that some nice pulls, and then just get this loop kind of straightened up. And then I'm going to add my ear wire, and then we're going to be done. So I just chose these kidney ear wires. They're really easy to put your earrings onto, really easy to put in your ear. And the only thing I wanted to make sure is that the, actually I'm going to need to turn my loop. It depending on what ear wires you pick. Sometimes the loop on your ear wire is parallel to the ear wire. Sometimes it's perpendicular, and that's going to affect which way you want your loop on your earring facing, so that it'll be facing out towards the front. So I'm just going to turn my loop so that it's facing frontwards, kind of perpendicular to my earring. And then I'm going to slide it on my ear wire. Like that. And that's all you do. You just slide it on your ear wire. And there you go. If you want to grab any of the tools and supplies I used to make this project, check out the links below. And tell me, if you were going to make resin earrings, what would you put in them? I used paper, but I want to hear what you would use. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you don't miss any future Jewel School projects. And now that you know how to make customizable resin earrings, you can say, I made this.